My name is Hector Acuna. I'm a mixed media artist from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and this is my thesis project titled The Barn. So the project works at three major components. This is the first, it's a sculpture. It's a half-size, scaled-down version of a barn that I grew up with in Kenosha, Wisconsin on my mom's farm property. And it sort of brings together different parts of its own structure to house other types of media. You can kind of hear and see on the inside there's this stop motion animation that's looping, where the viewer finds a clay subject that is very ambiguous and it's moving throughout the 3-minute animation. And you'll start to notice that there's this hand that's bringing objects into this virtual space of the barn. Some of these objects are food related, most of them are food related. Some of them are stereotypes within Mexican culture. Other objects are ones that are found in the community where I was raised in Wisconsin. Idea is really getting at this notion of consumption and cultural consumption and trying to hint at this idea of authenticity. So the barn as a whole work deals with a couple big concepts that are relevant to my own personal experiences in Wisconsin and even recently here in Michigan. But overall, it deals with representation, stereotype, it deals with ethnic and cultural identity and how that relates to the human body as a subject. From my own experiences, I've lived in different communities where people I meet will assume different things about my identity that sometimes are true, other times they're very false, but they're usually informed by some sort of stereotype that's either in media or in other types of information. So throughout this show, I try to bring in some of those different kinds of sources of information. So in the painting that you see on the right-hand side of the space, there's this illusion of space of the interior of the barn, and there's a self-portrait of the artist here, and overall the composition was inspired by Las Meninas, Diego Velázquez painting that deals with ideas of perception and representation and visibility. And I wanted to kind of borrow some of his compositional framework in my painting here. So I did this self-portrait, and there's a lot of different elements that I won't go through with you right now in the video, but I'll pull out a couple things that I think are really important. So there's this cluster of fragmented body parts that could be related back to the subject of the artist or of the self-portrait that you see on the left-hand side. There's this string that's sort of disconnected that connects again towards the right-hand side of this piñata that's hanging in this space. And surrounding this piñata are a lot of other signifiers and just references to pop culture, to other kinds of media, things that I grew up with, things that I've sort of rediscovered in the last couple months online. So I have memes that are basically focusing on things like my own name, actors that I've been told I look alike, other sort of references that that informed my own identity growing up in Wisconsin. So one of the big ones that's referenced a few times in the painting is this character from the American TV show, That 70s Show. Fez is the name of the character. So he's pictured a couple times in the painting. And honestly, this was a show I watched a lot growing up, and I really enjoyed the show as a kid. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I kind of reflected back on some of the writing in the show and just the way that stereotype functioned in that show. And the part of that experience that I think is really interesting is that the show takes place in Wisconsin, and they reference Kenosha in the show as well. So I kind of started to reflect on the way that the show informed my own sense of place and my own sense of identity, even though it was filmed in California. But the character Fez was somebody that I associated myself with just based on my own phenotypes and the demographic of my own community in Wisconsin. And it was one of the first characters that really started to reflect society's view of brown identity. and especially set in sort of a Midwest locale, which is something that I don't see in a lot of other types of media. So when I started making this painting, the process was really open. I was collecting a lot of different information and looking for different sources and different references that I felt related directly to my experiences and things that I have more of a complicated relationship to. So one of the big facts that informs my work in a whole is that my father, who I'm named after, was incarcerated for most of my life. So I grew up with my mom's side of the family. And this absence of my father made my own connection to my Mexican identity really complicated, and it continues to. So Fez, this character, this foreign exchange student, and this Brown character in the show was somebody I looked at to kind of fill in some of those gaps that I was missing in my own personal life. So the painting kind of brings a lot of these different things into the same space, and ideally the viewer could come up and just slowly start to decipher and dig through a lot of these references to think about how they connect or why they connect, because a lot of this is just really up in the air from my perspective. The other thing I'll point out while we're here is this art historical reference. So there's a couple paintings within the painting that I wanted to kind of inform the viewer's experience. The first here is a very loose rendition of the Las Meninas painting that I had mentioned earlier. We also have a Francisco Goya painting, Saturn devouring his son, and then in the very back is a really subdued version of the buffoon Don Juan, also by Velázquez. So my father's background I know is Spanish, so there's this interest that I have with Spanish painting especially, and that's informed some of my practice throughout my candidacy here at Michigan State as well. But come check out the painting if you can. It's one of my favorite paintings. We'll kind of move over this way. This structure of the barn is a project that was a pretty large experiment in my studio practice. When I had this idea that I wanted to focus on this motif of a barn that I grew up with in my upbringing in Wisconsin, I had a few versions of designs that I was sort of tossing around in my sketchbook, but I eventually landed on this very natural, realistic depiction of this Gothic style roof barn that we had on our property. But as I was building it, I kind of started to think more about ways that the structure of this building could house other projects or house other ideas within the space. And I was working on these smaller paintings, and at some point the two sort of converged, and I started thinking about the space of the barn in a little bit more of a flexible way. So I brought in these little paintings that could either be seen as windows into the space of the barn or mirrors reflecting the environment of this barn. And this corn pattern is definitely kind of this environmental encroaching that's happening onto the identity of the barn. And in these paintings, most of them are self-portraits. Most of the whole show actually is a self-portrait, so you'll see various versions of myself in the work. But I always try to speak through these really serious ideas in a very humorous way. That's something I've done through most of my work. And these three paintings, I think, are places where that comes through pretty clearly. And I started thinking more about the human body and sort of focusing in on the aspects of the skin, aspects of anatomy that I could flex or that I could exaggerate to speak to things that are a little bit more maybe magical or a little bit more surreal. So there's these moments where there's something maybe inside the body that's trying to escape, or there's something that's either entering the body or leaving the body. And I like this sense of flux that's happening within the subject of the figure in the paintings. And as I was doing that in the paintings, I started to think about that with the barn and what it means for some sort of object or some sort of material that's in this state of transition, that's not within and not outside, but it's sort of in between both of those states. So the barn became an object that I could also do that with in other ways. If you want to come to the back side of the barn. So on the back side of the barn, I kind of thought a little bit more about that idea of the interior and the exterior sort of happening at the same time. And in the painting and in other areas of the work, there's this kind of unnameable object, this green sort of goopy material that is here in a very physical way, but also in the paintings in this illusion of space. So I liked that kind of doubling that started to happen throughout the work, and just the repetitive subject reoccurring for the viewer to kind of find in different points, and then also to kind of overlap and reassociate. So here we have another sort of dual self-portrait with this chest painting and this little lovely little skin pocket with a tiny miniature sculpture of myself here. So you can take a look at that. One of the big things that I focused on throughout this project was texture, and thinking about how to represent a subject in multiple ways, but in different ways at each setting. So on the back side of the painting, I decided that I wanted this very real feeling of the barn wall that I grew up with, and I recreated this version of a cropped portion of this wooden barn wall, and left this small little window on the back side of the canvas that the viewer sees from the front side. So here I'm referencing the mirror that's in the Velázquez painting, the Las Meninas painting, which is reflecting the King and Queen of Spain, who are not pictured in the painting. And in doing this work and in referencing the Meninas painting, I was reading an article written by Michel Foucault, and in it he talks about the invisible and the visible, and he focuses at one point on the mirror that's in the painting, and I started to think about who would be reflected in my Meninas painting, the one on the opposite side of this wall. And thinking about this king and queen subject, I started to focus more on my parents and their relationship and my relationship to both of them. And I started thinking about the way that I've been perceived in the past, and which one of my parents I would be more readily associated to in terms of my own exterior. And more times than not, it's my father, somebody who I don't really know very well, as opposed to my mom, who raised my two half-siblings and I in Wisconsin. So I wanted to take this moment in my show and just reflect this invisible person in my own life, and to kind of directly tie the work back into this idea of perception and authenticity. So there's this moment in the show as well. And the last part of my show is this miniaturized version of the barn with a little bit of a landscape. And here I really became interested in the use of scale and the way that the use of doubling could say something else, or to add another layer into the show. So on the back side of this sculpture, there are these two rooms, and there's sort of this upper and lower level of the architecture of the sculpture. So on the upper level, we have this little triangular rope that mimics the line that's in the large painting, and also kind of mimics a piñata that's hanging inside of the barn in front of the animation. So I started to think about the piñata as this symbol in my studio practice after I had added it into the larger painting, and just this paper material that houses the inside of the piñata that people are slowly trying to break open and trying to reveal its inner matter. And I kind of saw this as a kind of a metaphor for what's happened in encounters I've had with other people in my life. So I was thinking about this piñata material and how I could use that throughout the show. And here I'm just leaving it in this very simple moment of either being pulled out or being consumed by the body that's pictured partially in the lower space of this sculpture. Overall, I'm hoping that the spectator will have various moments where they feel like they're looking at something relatively mysterious and ambiguous, and that's left for them to define or decipher, or to kind of reflect back into their own life and think, where have I seen this before? So in the large painting, there's a lot of these references to social media, pop culture, other types of media in TV and film, and I'm hoping that there's there's already a history for the viewer that they can kind of reevaluate now in this very curated experience in my show.